When silence becomes insurmountable and everyone has given up, a calm presence awakens something no one believed was possible. The winter garden of the Harrison Mansion, in the elegant Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston, was particularly beautiful that autumn afternoon. The oak trees on the horizon danced with the cold wind as Edward observed for the 1,000th time his daughter Claire sitting on the wooden bench by the fountain. The 8-year-old girl, with her brown hair tied in a simple braid and eyes attentive to the movement of the waters, remained immersed in the same silence that had already lasted almost 2 years. The mansion, built with the best of contemporary architecture, blended concrete, glass and wood in a harmony that was once Edward's pride. Now the spacious rooms, perfect lighting and sophisticated details seemed only to amplify the silence that dominated every space. The walls that once witnessed celebrations and laughter now held only the echo of frustrated attempts at communication. "Mr. Edward," Dr. Francis called again. "She wants to know if we can reschedule the appointment for tomorrow morning." Anna, the housekeeper, who had worked in the house for more than a decade, entered discreetly into the office where Edward took refuge between online meetings. "Tell her we'll keep the afternoon time. In the morning I have a video conference with the investors from New York," Edward replied without taking his eyes off the window. "And the new caregiver? Has she arrived yet?" "Not yet, sir. She should arrive in an hour, as arranged." Edward nodded silently. How many caregivers had already passed through that house? 6? 7? He had lost count. They all arrived with methods, techniques, approaches that promised progress. They all left defeated by Claire's stubborn silence. The last one, trained by the best child psychology university in the country, lasted only 3 weeks before admitting she needed another professional approach. The businessman sighed deeply as he rotated the wedding ring he still wore. Since the accident that took Lily, his wife, he found himself divided between commanding his technology empire and trying to recover his daughter from the emotional abyss into which she had plunged. The success he achieved in the former contrasted painfully with the continuous failure in the latter. The doorbell rang punctually at 3 in the afternoon. Edward, who would normally delegate reception to the housekeeper, felt an inexplicable impulse to answer personally. Perhaps it was the fatigue of waiting for miracles, perhaps the need to assess himself whether this new attempt would be worthwhile. "Good afternoon, I'm Julie Reese." The young woman waiting at the entrance had a simple and unpretentious appearance. She wore jeans, a light blue blouse, and carried a colorful fabric bag on her shoulder. Her curly hair was tied in an informal bun, and her smile was gentle, but without that professional anxiety that Edward already knew well. "You must be Mr. Harrison." "Edward, please," he replied, surprising himself with the sudden informality. "Come in." The contrast between Julie's simplicity and the contained opulence of the mansion was evident, but the young woman didn't seem intimidated like the other professionals who had crossed that door. Her gaze surveyed the environment with genuine curiosity, without the clinical judgment that Edward had learned to detect. "Would you like a coffee before meeting Claire?" he offered, following the protocol he had established with professional visitors. "I'd prefer to meet her first, if you don't mind." Julie responded with a naturalness that sounded almost impertinent. "Actually, if you could just show me where she is and briefly introduce me, that would be ideal. Afterwards, we can talk about routines and expectations." Edward felt a twinge of irritation at the inversion of the order he had planned, but he nodded. After all conventional approaches had failed. Perhaps it was time to accept the unconventional. He led Julie through the wide corridors of the mansion to the winter garden. Claire continued in the same position, now with a drawing pad on her lap, scribbling with colored pencils. Her small body, wrapped in a red cardigan, seemed even smaller against the lush backdrop of the garden. "Claire," Edward called softly, knowing he would not get a verbal response. "This is Julie. She'll be spending some time with us." The girl did not raise her eyes from the drawing. Her small fingers continued moving the blue pencil in circular strokes on the page. Julie did not seem disconcerted by the lack of reaction, as so many others had been. "Hello, Claire," she said in a calm voice, without that artificially animated intonation that many adults use with children. "May I sit here near you while you draw?" Without waiting for confirmation, Julie sat on the stone floor, at a respectful distance, but close enough to observe. She didn't try to look at the drawing, didn't ask questions, didn't offer empty compliments. She simply existed in the same space as Claire, with a patience that didn't seem rehearsed. Edward stood watching, waiting for the technical approach that would surely come. But the minutes passed and Julie remained silent, occasionally looking at the garden, at the plants, at the sky that was beginning to accumulate grey clouds. When Claire unexpectedly turned the page of the pad to start a new drawing, Julie just smiled discreetly, as if that small everyday gesture was, in itself, a victory. "I'll leave you two for now," Edward finally announced, disconcerted by the unusual scene. "I'll be in the office if you need anything." Julie nodded without taking her attention away from the shared space with Claire. There was something in the young caregiver's posture that intrigued Edward, a complete absence of the anxiety for results that he himself constantly carried. Back in the office, he tried to concentrate on the emails that were accumulating. The numbers from the latest acquisition were above expectations. The expansion to the northeast was progressing according to schedule. The company's stocks remained stable, despite market fluctuations. The empire he had built functioned with the precision of a Swiss watch, while his personal life remained frozen in time. 2 hours passed before Edward decided to check the garden again. He found Julie still sitting close to Claire, now with a small blue notebook in hand where she made her own notes. The girl continued drawing, apparently oblivious to the caregiver's presence, but something subtle had changed. Edward couldn't pinpoint what it was, but there was a different atmosphere hanging in the air. "How was it?" he asked when Julie finally entered the office, after Anna had taken Claire for her afternoon snack. "It was a good start," she replied simply, without that clinical report tone that Edward was used to hearing. "Claire has a very rich inner world." "How can you know? She didn't say anything, didn't interact with you." "Interaction doesn't need to be verbal to be meaningful," Julie explained, sitting in the chair that Edward indicated. Her drawings, the way she positions herself in space, how she reacts to sounds in the environment, all of this is communication. Edward felt the familiar skepticism arising. How many times had he heard similar phrases, vague promises dressed in psychological jargon? "I understand your distrust," Julie continued, surprising him with her perception. "But I'm not here to promise miracles or deadlines. I'm here to build a bridge in whatever time is necessary." "And how do you plan to do that? What is your method?" Edward asked, leaning back in the leather chair, preparing himself for another theoretical exposition. "I don't have a single method, Edward. I have observation, patience, and respect for Claire's timing. Every child who goes through trauma builds their own way back. My job is simply to identify that path and offer support for her to travel it when she's ready." There was a disconcerting honesty in Julie's words, an absence of the need to impress that Edward was used to finding in consultants and specialists. "I saw that you have a piano in the music room," Julie commented, subtly changing the direction of the conversation. "Does anyone play?" "Lily played." "My wife." The answer came automatically, accompanied by the familiar pain that the name still brought. Claire was beginning to learn when everything happened. Julie nodded, without pressing for more details, without offering rehearsed condolences. "The piano would be a good starting point," she said after a moment. "Music often reaches places that words can't." The rain began to fall outside, hitting against the office's wide windows. Edward watched the drops forming trails on the glass, thinking of how many times he had already bet on new approaches, new professionals, new hopes. "Let's try," he finally agreed, more from exhaustion than from conviction. "How long do you think it will take?" Julie smiled, a gentle but firm smile. "That's the question I can't answer, Edward. Claire will show us the way and the time. Our task is to be present and attentive when she decides to take the first steps." As the rain intensified outside, Edward felt something he had not experienced for a long time. Not exactly hope, not yet, but a momentary suspension of the despair that had accompanied him for so long. Perhaps, just perhaps, the silence that dominated the mansion was not as impenetrable as it seemed. The first weeks of Julie in the Harrison mansion established a routine that, although apparently simple, carried a subtle complexity that Edward was beginning to perceive. Unlike the other caregivers, Julie did not create a rigid schedule of activities or establish specific goals for Claire. Instead, she seemed to follow the girl's natural rhythm, like a boat that lets itself be carried by the current, but with a clear direction. The autumn weather in Boston, with its days sometimes grey, sometimes bathed by a pale sun, framed that silent dance. Edward, who had initially planned to reduce his hours at the office to closely monitor Julie's work, was surprised to realize that his constant presence was not necessary. The young caregiver kept him informed through small notes she left in his office, observations without technical jargon, reporting specific moments of the day that she considered significant. Claire spent 15 minutes watching the birds at the feeder today. When a robin landed closer, she smiled briefly. "I left some new pencils near the piano." She chose the blue and purple ones, ignoring the others. It rained hard in the afternoon. Claire stayed at the library window counting the thunder. I managed to count along with her using my fingers. We reached 7. Small fragments of the day that, in isolation, might seem insignificant, but which, in the sequence of days, formed a revealing mosaic. Edward kept each note in a drawer of his desk, rereading them at night, seeking the pattern that Julie seemed to see so clearly. It was in the 3rd week that Edward noticed the first concrete change. Returning early from a cancelled meeting, he found the house strangely quiet. Anna informed him that Julie and Claire had been in the music room since lunch. Moved by curiosity, he approached without making noise. The half-open door allowed him to see Claire sitting at the piano, not playing, just passing her fingers over the keys without pressing them. Julie was sitting on the floor a few meters away, with the blue notebook she always carried. Every now and then, she would hum a soft melody, almost a whisper. Claire didn't look at her, but her fingers seemed to follow the rhythm of the song on the silent keyboard. Edward remained motionless, afraid that his presence would break that fragile moment. Something was happening there, a communication that transcended words, a language that he couldn't completely decipher, but whose existence was undeniable. That night, after Claire fell asleep, Edward sought Julie on the small back porch of the house, where she usually had tea before retiring. "I saw you today in the music room," he commented, accepting the cup she offered. The aroma of chamomile filled the cold night air. What was happening? Julie blew on the hot tea before answering. "Claire is remembering the music. Not consciously, perhaps, but her body remembers. Her fingers remember. She played so little before." "Just starting lessons," Edward commented. The memory of Lily sitting at the piano with Claire in her lap, emerging vividly in his mind. "It's not just the lessons," Julie explained calmly. "It's the effective memory. The music she heard your wife play, the songs they perhaps sang together. These memories are stored not only in her mind, but in her body." Edward felt a lump in his throat. Talking about Lily was still difficult even after so long. She loved music. Our house was always full of sound before. "And then it went silent," Julie completed softly. "Complete silence," Edward confirmed, looking at the starry Boston sky. "As if all the music had gone away with her." "Perhaps it's time to bring the music back," Julie suggested. "Not as a painful reminder, but as a bridge to the present." In the days that followed, Edward noticed small changes in the house. The music room, which had remained virtually closed for so long, now had the curtains open, letting in natural light. The piano, which he had tuned at Julie's insistence, sometimes emitted loose notes during the day, not complete melodies, just isolated sounds, as if someone were testing its voice after a long period of muteness. One morning, as he came down for coffee, Edward found a small drawing on the kitchen table. It wasn't one of Claire's usual abstract scribbles. This one had more defined shapes, something that resembled the piano, a figure that could be Julie, and another smaller one, probably Claire herself. In the corner of the paper, a sequence of colored circles that Edward couldn't interpret. "She left this for you," Anna explained, serving the strong coffee he preferred. "She woke up earlier and stayed here in the kitchen drawing while I prepared breakfast." Edward studied the drawing carefully. It was the first time Claire had drawn something recognizable, the first time she had created a representation of real people and objects from her surroundings. Even more significant, it was the first time she had deliberately left a drawing for someone. When Julie arrived shortly afterwards, Edward showed her the drawing, unable to hide the emotion in his voice. "What do you think it means, these circles in the corner?" Julie observed the drawing carefully. "They look like musical notes," she replied. "Claire is drawing a melody. Can you identify which one it is?" "Not with certainty, but we can try to find out." Julie smiled. "It's an invitation, Edward. Claire is inviting us to understand her language." That afternoon, Edward cancelled 2 important meetings to be present when Julie took Claire to the music room. He sat discreetly in a corner, watching as the caregiver placed the drawing on the piano. "Shall we try to figure out what music this is, Claire?" Julie asked without expecting a verbal response. She began to play isolated notes on the piano, closely observing the girls' reactions. Claire remained motionless for a few minutes, just watching. Then, to Edward's surprise, she approached the piano and played a sequence of notes with one finger. The sound was simple, hesitant, but clearly intentional. "That's right," Julie gently encouraged. "Is that how it starts?" Claire played the same sequence again, this time adding 2 more notes. Julie repeated the passage, subtly expanding it, creating a musical dialogue. For almost half an hour, they built together a simple, fragmented, but recognizable melody. Edward felt a chill as he realized that he recognized the song. It was an old lullaby that Lily used to sing to Claire, a melody he hadn't heard for almost 2 years. The moment was interrupted when Claire, apparently tired from the exercise, moved away from the piano and returned to her drawing pad. Julie didn't insist, respecting the girl's rhythm as she always did. Later, when Claire was already in her room for her afternoon rest, Edward sought Julie. "That music, it was the lullaby that Lily sang to her before sleep." Julie nodded. "I suspected it was something like that. Musical memory is very powerful, Edward, especially when linked to moments of emotional security." "Do you think that means she's getting better?" Edward asked, trying to contain the hope that was beginning to grow. "It means she's finding ways to communicate," Julie replied cautiously. "Music is becoming a language for her, a way to express what words still can't." In the days that followed, new drawings appeared, some left in the kitchen, others in Edward's office, some in the music room itself. Each contained recognizable elements of everyday life, and those colored circles that Edward now knew represented musical notes. One morning, Edward found Julie in the library, organizing some children's books she had brought. "I noticed that you have few books for children," she commented. "I brought some that I thought Claire might like, stories with many images and some about music." "She never showed interest in books after—" Edward hesitated. "We tried with several psychologists, but she never paid attention to the stories." "Perhaps the problem was the approach," Julie gently suggested. "Sometimes it's not the story itself that matters, but how it is presented, without pressure, without expectations of immediate response." Edward observed the books that Julie arranged on the low shelf, within Claire's reach. Colorful covers, delicate illustrations, entire worlds contained in few pages. "Do you really believe she can speak again one day?" The question escaped before he could contain it, revealing the vulnerability he tried to hide. Julie didn't answer immediately. She finished organizing the last book before turning to Edward. "I believe Claire will find her voice, whatever it may be. It might be through spoken words or music or art, or some combination we haven't yet imagined. The important thing is that we are creating a space where she feels safe to experiment with these possibilities." Edward nodded, feeling an unexpected gratitude for Julie's honesty. There were no empty promises in her words, only a genuine commitment to the process, whatever the outcome. That night, when checking on Claire before sleep, Edward found one of the new books open on her bed. The girl was asleep, but one of her hands rested on the open page as if she had fallen asleep reading. It was a small gesture, perhaps insignificant to any external observer, but for Edward, it represented a world of possibilities. Carefully, without waking her, he adjusted the blanket and removed the book. It was a story about a little bird who had lost its song and traveled the world trying to find it. The illustrations were delicate in shades of blue and purple, the colors that Claire had been preferring in her recent drawings. Edward placed the book on the nightstand and, in an impulse he couldn't explain, leaned over and gently kissed his daughter's forehead. For a brief moment it seemed to him that Claire smiled in her sleep, but perhaps it was just a trick of the nightlight that illuminated the room. As he left, he found Julie in the hallway, with a cup of tea in her hands. "She was reading," he said, his voice low so as not to disturb the silence of the house. "I know," Julie smiled. "I passed by the room earlier and saw her leafing through the book. She paid special attention to the pages where the little bird meets other musical animals." "The book, it's about finding one's own voice," Edward commented, understanding Julie's deliberate choice. "Sometimes, stories help us understand our own journey," she replied simply. "Good night, Edward." As he watched her walk away down the hall, Edward felt something he had not experienced for a long time, a glimpse of a future that wasn't completely tinged by the pain of the past. The mansion, which for so long had been merely a repository of painful memories and oppressive silence, finally seemed to breathe again, filled with the small sounds of life resuming its course. The month of June arrived in Boston, bringing more intense cold and frequently cloudy skies. The Harrison mansion, with its efficient heating systems, remained cozy, but Edward couldn't help noticing how the weather seemed to influence Claire's mood. On darker days, she spent more time in her room drawing incessantly, or leafing through the books that Julie had brought. On the rare sunny days, it was easier to find her in the winter garden or near the large windows of the music room. Julie, always attentive to these patterns, adapted her approaches according to the girl's rhythm. Edward increasingly admired this capacity for silent reading, this attunement that the young caregiver had established with his daughter without direct words, only through patient and respectful observation. "The summer festival is coming," Julie commented one morning as they had coffee in the kitchen. Claire was in the music room, experimenting with loose notes on the piano as had become her morning habit. "I thought about bringing some elements to the house, if you don't object." Edward raised his eyes from the laptop screen where he was reviewing some emails. "Elements? Colorful banners, maybe some typical recipes," Julie explained. "The visual and sensory aspect of celebrations can be stimulating, especially the colors and flavors." Edward pondered for a moment. Since the accident, celebrations had practically disappeared from the mansion. Not even Claire's birthday was celebrated in a traditional way, just a simple cake and a carefully chosen gift, which the girl received with the same distant expression as always. "Do you think she'll respond well to this?" "Claire has shown increasing interest in visual patterns and colors," Julie replied. "The traditional banners, with their repetitive shapes and vibrant colors, might spark her curiosity. Besides, the music of summer festivals has striking rhythms that connect with our cultural memory." Edward nodded slowly. The approach made sense, like everything Julie proposed, always based on careful observation of Claire's reactions, never imposed as an external technique. "All right, we can try." In the following days, small transformations began to appear in the mansion. Colorful banners were discreetly hung in the winter garden. A basket with decorative corn husks emerged on the kitchen table. The aroma of homemade cornbread and apple pie filled the house on a particularly cold afternoon, when Julie and Anna dedicated themselves to preparing some traditional recipes. Claire observed these changes with silent attention. Edward caught her several times standing under the banners, looking up, watching how they moved with the slight breeze from the ventilation system. On one of these occasions, upon noticing her father's presence, she didn't move away as she usually did. Instead, she pointed upward, a simple but significant gesture. It was one of the rare times that Claire initiated a form of direct communication with him. "They're pretty, aren't they?" Edward commented, approaching cautiously. "Julie hung them for you." Claire didn't respond verbally, but her eyes followed the movement of the banners for a few more moments before she moved away toward the music room, her usual refuge. That night, Edward found Julie in the library, organizing some old sheet music she had discovered in a box stored in the basement. "Where did you find this?" he asked, recognizing Lily's handwriting in some annotations in the margins. "Anna mentioned that there were some boxes with your wife's belongings stored away," Julie replied carefully. "I asked if I could look, specifically searching for musical material. I hope you don't mind." Edward picked up one of the sheet music, feeling the slightly yellowed paper between his fingers. It was a Chopin sonata that Lily loved to play on winter nights. He could almost hear the notes echoing through the corridors of the mansion, the sound of the piano filling every corner with life. "No, I don't mind," he finally answered. "In fact, they should have been retrieved long ago. I just didn't have courage, I suppose." Julie nodded with understanding. "I found something interesting among the sheet music," she commented, extending a yellowed envelope. "It seems to be a letter." Edward immediately recognized the paper and handwriting. It was the type of letter that Lily occasionally wrote when she was particularly inspired or emotional. Small messages she would leave for him to find, sometimes in the pocket of a jacket, other times between the pages of a book he was reading. With slightly trembling hands, he opened the envelope. The letter was short, dated 2 weeks before the accident. "Edward, Today, while playing for Claire, I realized that she can already recognize the melodies she likes most. Her little eyes shine when I start Für Elise, and she smiles with the theme from Claire de Lune. I'm creating a small composition for her, something simple that we can play together when her little hands grow a bit more. Music will be our eternal bond, our secret language. With all my love, Lily. Edward felt the familiar lump in his throat, but this time it wasn't just pain. There was something more, a rediscovered connection with the woman he had loved, with the plans they had made together for their daughter. She was composing something for Claire, he said after a few moments of silence. I didn't know that. Do you think the composition might be among these sheet music? Julie asked softly. Maybe. Lily used to keep her works in progress in the piano bench. There's a compartment. Let's check tomorrow, Julie suggested. It's getting late, and Claire must be asleep already. The next morning, Edward woke up to a sound he hadn't heard in years. Piano notes, not random as in previous days, but forming a hesitant, interrupted but recognizable melody. He got up quickly and headed to the music room. Claire was sitting at the piano alone, her small fingers trying to find the right notes. Julie remained a few meters away, watching attentively without interfering. Upon noticing Edward's presence, she made a discreet gesture for him not to interrupt the moment. The melody that Claire was trying to reproduce was simple, almost like a children's song, but with nuances that Edward immediately recognized as Lily's style. It wasn't a piece he knew, which could only mean one thing. It was the composition mentioned in the letter, the music that Lily had created especially for her daughter. Claire stopped abruptly upon noticing her father's presence. Her hands remained motionless over the keys, and for a moment Edward feared that the enchantment would be broken. But then the girl pointed to a handwritten sheet music open on the piano, the same direct and intentional gesture she had made with the banners. Edward approached slowly and looked at the paper. It was undoubtedly Lily's handwriting, with annotations in the margins and a simple title at the top. For Claire, my little musician. You found this? He asked softly, addressing both Claire and Julie. It was Julie who answered. We were looking in the piano bench compartment, as you mentioned. Claire was the one who found it, actually. She opened the bench when I arrived this morning. Edward looked at his daughter in surprise, who kept her eyes fixed on the sheet music, as if deciphering some secret code. Do you want me to play it for you, Claire? Edward asked, feeling strangely vulnerable. To his surprise, Claire moved slightly on the bench, making room beside her, a silent but unequivocal invitation. Edward sat down, aware that this was the closest moment he had had with his daughter in almost 2 years. I'm not as good at this as your mother was, he gently warned, positioning his fingers over the keys. Lily had tried to teach him a few times, but he had never had the patience necessary to learn properly. He knew only the basics, enough to recognize the notes on the sheet music and reproduce them in a clumsy way. He began to play slowly, occasionally making mistakes, having to stop and restart some measures. The melody was sweet and simple, clearly conceived for small hands and beginner skills. There was something in it that perfectly captured Lily's essence, her gentleness, her quiet joy, her deep love for her daughter. When he finished, a special silence hung in the room. Not the oppressive silence that had dominated the mansion for so long, but a silence full of meaning, of emotions shared without the need for words. Claire extended her hand and played some notes, reproducing a snippet of the melody with more precision than Edward had managed. Then, unexpectedly, her small hand rested on his for a brief moment before withdrawing. The simple gesture made Edward hold his breath. It was the first physical contact that Claire had initiated since the accident. Julie, observing discreetly, smiled with approval. In the days that followed, the sheet music remained open on the piano, and Claire spent more and more time trying to reproduce the melody. Sometimes Edward accompanied her. Other times it was Julie who sat beside her, with more musical ability than him, gently guiding the small fingers to the correct keys. One afternoon, while Edward was working in his office, he heard a soft knock on the door. It was Anna with a puzzled expression. "Mr. Edward, I think you should see this." Following the housekeeper to the kitchen, Edward found a new drawing by Claire on the table. This one was different from the previous ones, more structured, more defined. It showed 3 figures near a piano, a woman with long wavy hair who could only be Lily, Claire in her favorite blue dress, and a male figure that clearly represented Edward. Above them, Colourful musical notes floated like balloons, connecting the three figures. She left this and went to the garden with Julie, Anna explained. I was surprised because, well, it's the first time she's drawn Mrs. Lily since... Edward nodded, unable to speak as he observed the drawing. It was more than simple artistic progress. It was a reconnection with memories that Claire had suppressed, an integration of the past with the present that pointed to possibilities of healing. Through the kitchen window, he could see Claire and Julie in the garden, picking some flowers. Claire held a small basket, concentrating on her task, while Julie spoke calmly, probably explaining the names of the plants or their characteristics. It was an everyday scene, common, but for Edward it represented a silent miracle, his daughter gradually emerging from the protective shell where she had taken refuge. That night, after Claire fell asleep, Edward found Julie on the porch, in her habitual ritual of evening tea. Today's drawing, he began, still processing his emotions. She drew Lily. Julie nodded. The music is bringing the memories back, Edward. Not just the cognitive memories, but the emotional ones. Claire is beginning to integrate the past into the present. And is that good? Edward asked, a remnant of concern in his voice. Won't it make her suffer again? The suffering never disappeared, Julie explained gently. It was just encapsulated, protected behind the silence. Now she's finding ways to process it, to express it through art and music. It's a path to healing. Edward contemplated Julie's words as he observed the lights of the city in the distance. Boston stretched below them, a terrestrial constellation of luminous points in the darkness. Tomorrow is the winter solstice, Julie commented after a few moments of comfortable silence. The shortest day of the year, followed by gradually longer and brighter days. Edward understood the implicit metaphor. Perhaps they too were going through their own solstice, the darkest point already surpassed, with the promise of growing light on the horizon. I thought about having a small celebration, Julie continued. Nothing elaborate, just some candles, maybe play a bit of Lily's music, share that cornbread that Claire seemed to like. She liked it? Edward asked, surprised. Claire rarely demonstrated defined food preferences since the accident. She took a second piece yesterday, Julie smiled. Small gestures, Edward. It's the small gestures that rebuild entire worlds. That night, Edward dreamed of Lily for the first time in months. It wasn't a painful dream like the previous ones, filled with powerlessness and loss. In this one, she smiled while playing the piano, Claire by her side, and he watching from nearby, all connected by the music that flowed between them like an invisible river of affection and shared memories. He woke up with a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The path ahead would still be long, and there would certainly be difficult days, but now there was a direction, a subtle but undeniable movement toward the light. From the hallway came the hesitant sound of the piano. Claire was already awake, continuing her musical journey note by note, rediscovering the language that her mother had planned to share with her. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to simply listen, recognizing in the imperfect notes the promise that the silence, after all, was not permanent. The first weeks of July brought an even more intense cold to Boston, with morning frosts that transformed the garden of the Harrison mansion into an almost magical scene. Claire developed the habit of waking up early to observe this phenomenon, her small face pressed against the glass of the bedroom window, looking fascinated as the rising sunlight reflected on the ice crystals that covered the vegetation. Edward, in turn, had developed the habit of waking up earlier too, not to observe the frost, but to observe Claire. These silent mornings became an unplanned ritual between father and daughter, she contemplating the outside world, he contemplating her, both engaged in a type of silent communication that, although limited, was more than they had had in the last 2 years. The solstice celebration that Julie organized was simple, but meaningful. Small candles were arranged throughout the music room. Lily's composition was played, this time by Julie with more skill than Edward could manage, and the cornbread was shared in a comfortable silence. Claire didn't speak, but remained present throughout the small ceremony, her eyes reflecting the candlelight, while her fingers occasionally moved in the air as if playing invisible keys. That night marked a subtle change in Claire's behavior. In the days that followed, she began to leave notes, not just drawings but small words written in her childish and hesitant handwriting. The first appeared on the refrigerator door, held by a colorful magnet, cold. Just that, a solitary word that made Edward and Anna exchange astonished looks. "Did she write this?" Edward asked, although he knew the answer. "She left it there while I was preparing breakfast," Anna confirmed, a rare emotion coloring her usually controlled voice. "She showed it to me after sticking it on and then ran out to the garden." When Julie arrived, Edward showed her the note with a mixture of excitement and caution. "It's the beginning of written communication," Julie commented, not seeming as surprised as Edward expected. "The words are coming back, first on paper, where she has control over how and when they are revealed." "You expected this?" "I expected some form of communication beyond drawings," Julie explained. "The drawings with musical notes were already a form of symbolic writing. Now she's advancing to more conventional symbols." New notes began to appear around the house, single words, sometimes simple nouns like tree, piano, book, other times adjectives like blue or warm. They were like scattered clues of a larger puzzle that Claire was slowly assembling. On a particularly cold afternoon, Edward arrived home earlier than usual. An important meeting had been cancelled at the last minute, and he decided to take advantage of the unexpected time to be with Claire. He found the house quiet, except for the muffled sound coming from the music room. He approached cautiously, not wanting to interrupt whatever was happening. Through the crack in the door, he saw Claire sitting at the piano with Julie beside her. But what surprised him was not the scene itself, already familiar, but what he heard. "G, D, face," Julie was saying softly, playing each note. "G, D, E," a small and hesitant voice repeated. Edward froze, hardly daring to breathe. It was Claire's voice, hoarse from disuse, almost a whisper, but unmistakably her voice. Julie played another set of notes. "C, G, E, C, G, E," Claire repeated, a little stronger this time. Edward remained motionless, witnessing the moment through the door crack, afraid that his presence might break the spell. There was something deeply intimate about that scene, not just Claire speaking again after so long, but the context in which it happened, through music, the language that Lily had planned to share with her. When finally the notes ceased and Claire closed the piano lid, Edward retreated silently down the hallway, too moved to announce himself. He needed a moment to process what he had just witnessed. He withdrew to his office, gently closing the door behind him. A few minutes later, he heard a light knock. Julie entered without waiting for a response, as if she knew he would be there. "You saw," she said. It wasn't a question. Edward nodded, unable to find words for a moment. "She spoke," he finally managed to say, his voice trembling. "After so long, she spoke." "It's just the names of the notes for now," Julie clarified, sitting in the chair across from the desk. "It started a few days ago, very quietly. Today was the first time she spoke in a normal volume." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I wanted to be sure it wasn't an isolated event," Julie explained calmly, "and Claire needed to feel she had control over this process. If there was too much attention, too much expectation, she might retreat." Edward understood the logic, even though part of him wished he had been informed immediately. "And now? What happens next?" "We continue at her pace," Julie answered simply. "Music is creating a safe path for her voice to return. The musical notes are a first step. They're neutral, predictable, without the emotional charge that words can carry." That night, during dinner, Edward observed Claire with new attention. She ate in silence, as always, but there was a different quality to her presence, a sharper awareness of the environment, an occasional eye contact that was previously rare. "The music you were practicing today sounded very beautiful," Edward commented casually, following Julie's guidance not to pressure or show excessive expectation. Claire looked at him for a moment longer than usual, then returned her attention to her plate. But seconds later, to Edward's surprise, she murmured something almost inaudible. "What was that, sweetheart?" he asked softly, controlling the emotion in his voice. "Mommy," Claire said, a little more clearly this time. "Mommy's music." Edward felt the air leave his lungs as if he had taken a physical blow. It was the first time in almost 2 years that Claire had mentioned Lily. The simple sound of that word, "Mommy," in her small and hesitant voice, triggered an avalanche of emotions that Edward could barely contain. "Yes," he managed to respond, his voice choked. "It's your mommy's music. She made it especially for you." Claire nodded slightly and went back to eating, as if that brief exchange hadn't been extraordinary. But Edward saw, from the tremor in her small fingers holding the fork, that the casualness was only apparent. Each word pronounced was an act of courage, a step out of the protective silence that had enveloped her for so long. Later, after putting Claire to bed, Edward found Julie in the library. She was organizing some new children's books she had brought. These focused on stories about music and artistic expression. "She spoke during dinner," he said without preamble. "She said, 'Mommy.' She talked about Lily's music." Julie smiled, a gentle smile that reflected understanding of the importance of that moment. "It's a big step, Edward. She's beginning to verbalize her memories, to connect past and present through words." "How did you do this?" Edward asked, a mixture of gratitude and admiration in his voice. "All the specialists, all the methods we tried before." "It wasn't me who did this," Julie gently corrected. "It was Claire. She always had the ability. She just needed to find her own path, her own time. My role was simply to create a space where she felt safe to try." Edward sat in one of the library armchairs, processing Julie's words. "I think we were always too focused on techniques, on protocols. I hired the best specialists, read all the recommended books on childhood trauma." He paused, reflecting. "But perhaps what she needed was exactly the opposite. Less technique and more humanity." "Children are remarkably resilient," Julie commented, sitting in the opposite armchair. "And they have their own healing mechanisms. Sometimes our role as adults is simply not to hinder that natural process, to offer presence instead of pressure, patience instead of expectations." In the weeks that followed, Claire's voice gradually returned. First with isolated words, then small phrases, always in specific and controlled contexts. Music continued to be the main catalyst. It was during the piano sessions that she spoke most easily, as if the musical notes opened pathways for words to emerge. One morning, while Edward was having coffee, Claire entered the kitchen carrying one of the books that Julie had brought. It was the story of the little bird who had lost its song, the same one that Edward had found on her bed weeks before. "Can you read to me?" she asked, her voice still small but firmer than in previous days. Edward felt his heart race at the unexpected request. It was the first time Claire had directly asked him for something, the first clear initiative of connection coming from her. "Of course," he replied, pushing aside the laptop and documents he was reviewing. Nothing was more important at that moment. Claire sat beside him, not on his lap as she did before the accident, but close enough that she could see the illustrations while Edward read. The story of the small bird who traveled the world in search of its lost song gained new meanings as the pages were turned. "Why did he lose his song?" Claire asked when they reached the middle of the book. Edward reflected on the question, understanding that it wasn't just about the character in the story. "Sometimes we lose things when something sad happens," he answered carefully. "The little bird became so sad that he forgot how to sing." Claire nodded, absorbing the explanation. "Like I forgot how to talk." The simplicity of the statement hit Edward with force. It was the first time Claire had explicitly acknowledged her own silence. "Yes," he agreed softly. "But like the bird in the story, you're finding your voice again." "With music," Claire added, running her finger over the illustration where the little bird met other musical animals. "With music," Edward agreed. "Your mother always said that music can say things that words can't." Claire looked at him with surprising intensity. "Do you remember her music?" Edward felt a lump in his throat. "I remember all of it. She played every night, remember? Especially in winter when we spent more time indoors." "I remember," Claire said softly, and for a moment Edward glimpsed in his daughter's face a pain that mirrored his own. Not the dazed confusion of a child, but a genuine understanding, albeit limited by age, of what they had lost. "Can we finish the story?" she asked after a moment of silence. Edward continued reading, his voice occasionally failing with contained emotion. When they reached the end, where the little bird finally rediscovered its song by helping another animal in difficulty, Claire remained silent, absorbing the message. "Did you like the ending?" Edward asked. Claire thought for a moment. Yes. He had the music inside him all along. The depth of the observation surprised Edward. It was an insight that seemed beyond Claire's 8 years, an intuitive understanding of the process she herself was going through. That afternoon, when Julie arrived, she found father and daughter in the music room. Edward wasn't playing, he had never had Lily's talent, but he was sitting close to the piano, while Claire practiced the small composition that her mother had created for her. The melody already sounded more fluid, the errors less frequent, the pauses more intentional than hesitant. "Looks like we had a good morning," Julie commented, observing the different atmosphere in the room. "Claire asked me to read a story to her," Edward explained, a discreet smile on his lips. "And we talked about several things." Julie smiled, understanding the magnitude of what wasn't being said. "What a wonderful story," she said, addressing Claire. "Would you like to tell me about it later?" Claire nodded, continuing to play. The notes of Lily's composition filled the room, no longer as a painful ghost of the past, but as a bridge connecting what was lost to what could be rebuilt. As he observed the scene, Edward felt a growing certainty that, regardless of the challenges they would still face, they had turned an important page. The Boston winter continued outside, with its intense cold and frequently grey skies, but inside the Harrison mansion, something was unmistakably thawing. August arrived in Boston, bringing strong winds and an alternation between icy days and brief periods of timid sun that announced the gradual approach of fall. In the Harrison mansion, other changes, equally gradual but significant, continued to develop at Claire's own pace. The girls' verbal communication expanded each week. What had begun with isolated words and short phrases evolved into simple conversations, still punctuated by long silences and occasional retreats when the topic approached too close to painful memories. Julie continued to guide this process with her characteristic patience, never pressing, always respecting the boundaries that Claire established for herself. Edward, in turn, was learning to balance his natural anxiety for progress with the understanding that Claire's journey of recovery would not follow a predictable schedule. There were days of surprising advances, when the girl spoke more freely or shared memories that he thought were lost forever. And there were other days when she returned to almost complete silence, taking refuge in her drawings or at the piano, as if she needed to recharge after the emotional effort of reconnecting with the world. It was on one of these quieter mornings that Edward found Claire in the music room, not playing, but organizing Lily's sheet music that Julie had rescued from storage. The girl was separating them into small piles with a concentration that reminded Edward of her mother. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" he asked softly, sitting in a nearby armchair. Claire continued her task for a few moments before answering, "Organizing the music, like Mommy did." Edward felt the familiar tightness in his chest that still arose when Claire mentioned Lily directly. It was no longer the sharp pain of the first months after the accident, but a deep melancholy mixed with gratitude for each memory that his daughter managed to rescue and share. "She was always very organized with her sheet music," he commented, observing how Claire separated the pieces by composer, exactly as Lily used to do. "She said that music has to breathe," Claire replied, surprising Edward with the clarity of the memory. "That sheet music needs space to dream before being played." Edward couldn't contain an emotional smile. It was exactly the type of poetic phrase that Lily would use, and that he had no idea Claire had registered and kept. "She told you that?" Claire nodded, continuing her methodical organization. "When I helped her put away the music after lessons, before—" The phrase hung in the air, incomplete. Edward knew that he shouldn't press, that he should allow Claire to establish the boundaries of her own narrative, but there was something in the moment, an opening that rarely presented itself, that encouraged him to ask. Before the accident, Claire stopped what she was doing, her small hands motionless over the sheet music. For a moment, Edward feared he had gone too far, had broken the safety bubble that the girl had so carefully built around her most painful memories. "I was in the car," Claire finally said, her voice almost a whisper, "with Mommy." Edward felt his heart accelerate. It was the first time Claire had directly mentioned the accident that had taken Lily's life. The same accident that Claire had survived with only physical scratches, but deep emotional scars. "I know, sweetheart," he replied softly, resisting the impulse to approach, giving her the space that her tense body clearly requested. "It was raining a lot," Claire continued, looking at the sheet music without really seeing them. "Mommy was singing that song she made for me. The song that now Claire practiced daily on the piano, the composition that had become a sort of guiding thread in her journey back to speech. She always sang to you in the car," Edward commented, keeping his voice calm despite the storm of emotions he felt. Claire nodded. "The car spun on the water. Mommy stopped singing." The devastating simplicity of the description hit Edward like a physical blow. Those few words told, from the perspective of a 6-year-old child, the moment when her life changed forever. I was scared, Claire continued, now looking out the window, as if seeing the scene unfolding again before her eyes. I called Mommy, but she didn't answer. There was a lot of noise, a lot of water. Edward breathed deeply, fighting against the tears that threatened to fall. He knew he needed to be strong for Claire at this moment, that he needed to give her the space to express what she had kept imprisoned for so long. "You were very brave," he said, when he felt he could speak without his voice betraying his emotion. Claire turned to him, her eyes enormous in her small face. "I wasn't brave. I went silent. I couldn't talk anymore." The clarity with which Claire articulated her own experience surprised Edward. There was an awareness in her words that went beyond what he would expect from an 8-year-old child, as if part of her had aged a great deal in those terrible minutes inside the car. "Sometimes staying silent is the only way we find to deal with very difficult things," he explained gently. "It doesn't mean you weren't brave." Claire considered the words for a moment, touching the sheet music again, rearranging them without apparent purpose. "Julie said that my voice was hidden, but it didn't disappear, like the little bird song in the story." "And she was right," Edward smiled softly. "Your voice was always there, waiting for the right moment to return." "The music helped," Claire said simply. "Mommy's music." "Your mother would be very happy to know that," Edward replied, finally allowing a tear to roll down his face. "She loved you very much, Claire, more than anything in the world." Claire looked at him with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. "You were sad too," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "You went silent too." The observation hit Edward deeply. Yes, he too had retreated into a kind of silence, not verbal like Claire, but emotional. He had taken refuge in work, in practical responsibilities, avoiding fully immersing himself in the pain of loss. "You're right," he admitted. "I also went silent in my own way. Perhaps I'm still learning to speak again, just like you." Claire nodded, as if the answer made perfect sense to her. Then, to Edward's surprise, she stood up and approached, extending a piece of paper in his direction. It was one of the sheet music she had been organizing. This was her favorite, Claire said. She played it when she was happy. Edward immediately recognized the piece, Claire de Lune by Debussy, which Lily played on quiet nights, when it was just the three of them at home, away from the pressures of the outside world. "You remember her playing this?" he asked, genuinely surprised that Claire retained such specific memories. "I remember," Claire replied. She closed her eyes when she reached the most beautiful parts. Edward smiled through the tears that now fell freely. "Yes, she did. She said she needed to feel the music, not just play it." Claire hesitated for a moment, then did something she hadn't done since the accident. She extended her hand and touched Edward's face, drying one of his tears with her small finger. "Don't be sad, Daddy," she said softly. "Mommy's music is still here." Edward felt his heart expand painfully with the gesture and the words. In that moment, it wasn't clear who was consoling whom, whether the father was consoling the daughter or the daughter the father. Perhaps it was both, finding comfort in each other for the first time since the tragedy that had separated them. When Julie arrived later that morning, she found Edward and Claire still in the music room. Claire had returned to her task of organizing the sheet music, now with her father's help, who shared small stories about when Lily played each piece. "Looks like we have a productive morning," Julie commented, perceiving the different atmosphere in the room. "Claire is helping me rediscover some memories," Edward explained, exchanging a complicit look with his daughter. "We talked about Mommy," Claire added, with a naturalness that made Julie's eyes widen slightly. "And about the accident." Julie nodded, maintaining her calm expression despite the evident surprise. "Those are important conversations," she said, sitting near them. "How are you feeling, Claire?" The girl considered the question for a moment. "A little sad," she answered honestly, "but also light, as if I had taken something heavy out of me." Julie smiled, clearly moved by the girl's articulation. "That's exactly how it works," she explained gently. "When we keep very big feelings inside us, they become heavy. Sharing them helps us carry the weight." In the days that followed, Claire continued to speak more freely about her memories of Lily and gradually about the accident. Each conversation seemed to release a little more of her voice, as if the silence that enveloped her was a dam that now had small openings, allowing the water to flow in a controlled manner. One afternoon, while practicing piano under Julie's guidance, Claire stopped abruptly in the middle of her mother's composition. "There's a part missing," she said, frowning at the sheet music. "Mommy didn't finish it." Julie looked at the music, confirming Claire's observation. The composition ended abruptly in the middle of the second page, as if Lily had been interrupted during the creative process, which probably had happened, considering the date of the letter that Edward had found. "You're right," Julie agreed. "It seems she was still working on this piece." Claire remained silent for a few moments, her fingers hovering over the keys. "I know how it continues," she said finally. "You know?" Julie asked, surprised. Claire nodded and, without further explanation, began to play. She followed the sheet music written by Lily until the point where it ended, then, without pause, continued with a melody that seemed to flow naturally from the previous one. It wasn't technically perfect. Her small fingers were still learning, and occasionally a note sounded discordant, but there was an emotional coherence in the music that was undeniable. Julie remained absolutely still, aware that she was witnessing something extraordinary. When Claire finally finished, leaving the last note hanging in the air, Julie asked softly, "How did you know the continuation, Claire?" "I heard Mommy practicing," the girl explained. "Before sleep, she played different endings trying to find the right one. This was the one she liked most." Julie felt a shiver run down her spine. Claire's musical memory had preserved something that would otherwise have been lost forever. The conclusion of Lily's last composition, a final gift for her daughter. "Would you like to write that part?" Julie suggested. "To complete your mother's sheet music?" Claire seemed to consider the idea seriously. "I don't know how to write music," she replied finally. "I can help," Julie offered. "You play, I write. We can work together to complete what your mother started." Claire nodded slowly, a look of determination appearing on her face. "She would like that," the girl said. "She always said that music needs to be shared to be complete." That night, Edward found on his desk a new note from Julie, different from the daily report she usually left. "Edward, something extraordinary happened today. Claire revealed that she knows the conclusion of the composition that Lily was creating for her. We've begun working together to transcribe it. I suggest we organize a small performance when it's ready, perhaps for Claire's birthday next month. It could be a significant moment to mark how far she has come. Julie." Edward read the note several times, struggling to fully comprehend what Julie was describing. Claire had memorized a part of the composition that Lily had never managed to record. The idea was simultaneously astonishing and deeply moving. In the days that followed, Edward observed from a distance as Claire and Julie worked on completing the piece. Claire repeatedly played snippets of the melody. Julie made notes on a new sheet music, occasionally asking questions or making suggestions that Claire considered seriously before accepting or refusing. It was a fascinating collaborative process to watch, the 8-year-old girl guiding the adult through the musical memories she had preserved, both working to honor Lily's original intention while allowing Claire's interpretation to also have space. One afternoon, as Edward passed by the music room, he heard something that made him stop abruptly. It wasn't just the piano that was sounding. There was a voice accompanying the melody, a small, hesitant voice, but clearly singing. Through the crack in the door, he saw Claire at the piano, playing the now complete composition while softly humming along with the music. There were no words, just a melodic vocalization that followed the piano notes. Julie was sitting a little distance away, observing with a serene smile without interfering in the moment. Edward remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe. It was the first time he had heard Claire sing since the accident. The sight of her at the piano, recreating not only Lily's music but adding her own voice to it, was almost more than his heart could bear. When the music ended, Claire remained silent for a few moments, her hands still on the keys. Then, without turning around, she said, "You can come in, Daddy." Edward entered the room, surprised and a little embarrassed at having been discovered. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't interrupt," Claire replied, turning to him. "The music is finished." There was something different in Claire's face, a tranquility, a presence that Edward hadn't seen since before the accident, as if a part of her that had been asleep had finally awakened. "It was beautiful," he said, approaching the piano. "I didn't know you were singing too." Claire shrugged, a surprisingly casual gesture for her. "The music asks for it. Mommy always said that some melodies need a voice." She did say that, Edward agreed, sitting beside her on the piano bench. You remember a lot of things she said, don't you? Claire nodded. I remember everything. I just couldn't talk about it before. The simplicity of the statement hid the depth of the process that Claire had gone through, the long silence, the gradual reconnection through music, the slow recovery of her voice. I'm very proud of you, Claire, Edward said, feeling that the words were insufficient to express the emotion he felt. Very, very proud. Claire looked at him with her serious eyes, so much like Lily's. Julie said we're going to do a performance on my birthday. I can play Mommy's complete music. I think that's a wonderful idea, Edward replied. Your mother would love to know that you completed what she started. Claire smiled, a small but genuine smile, increasingly frequent in recent days. She knows, the girl said with surprising certainty. Music connects people, even when they're far away. Mommy always said that. Edward felt tears fill his eyes again, but this time they weren't just of sadness. There was something more, a sense that a cycle was completing, that a deep wound, although it could never be completely healed, was finally beginning to scar. Julie, who had been observing the scene in silence, approached with the sheet music in her hands. It's almost ready, she said, showing the pages where Lily's elegant writing now merged with Julie's more technical notations. Claire has an excellent musical ear. The transition between what Lily wrote and what Claire remembered is practically perfect, as if it were a conversation between the two, Edward commented, looking at the sheet music. Exactly like that, Julie agreed, exchanging a significant look with Claire. A conversation through music. That night, when the house finally quieted, Edward remained awake in his office, rereading Lily's letter they had found among the sheet music. Music will be our eternal bond, our secret language. The words, written without Lily being able to imagine what would happen just 2 weeks later, had become prophetically true. Music had indeed become the bond between mother and daughter, the language that had allowed Claire to find her voice again. Through the window, Edward could see the lights of Boston shining against the night sky. Inside the mansion, the silence was no longer oppressive as before. It was a peaceful silence, punctuated by the small sounds of a house where life was gradually finding its way back. The morning of Claire's 9th birthday dawned with an exceptionally blue sky in Boston, as if nature itself wanted to participate in the celebration. The first signs of fall were already noticeable in the garden of the Harrison mansion. Small green shoots emerged among the vegetation, still recovering from the rigorous winter, just as Claire gradually emerged from her own emotional winter. Edward woke up early, a mixture of expectation and nostalgia weighing in his heart. Birthdays had been bittersweet moments since the accident, contained celebrations marked by Lily's absence and Claire's silence. But this one would be different. The transformation his daughter had undergone in recent months guaranteed that. As he went down to the kitchen, he found Anna already busy with the preparations. The housekeeper, normally so contained in her emotions, couldn't hide her excitement. I made the chocolate cake that Miss Claire likes, she commented, as she organized the batter in the pans. And those small chocolate truffles she used to love. Thank you, Anna, Edward replied, genuinely touched by the housekeeper's care. Are you sure you don't need help with the preparations for this afternoon? Anna dismissed the offer with a gesture. Everything is under control, Mr. Edward. Julie already brought the decorations yesterday, and the catering arrives after lunch. You only need to worry about being present for Miss Claire. Being present. It was something that Edward had been learning to do with more awareness in recent months, not just physically, but emotionally available, attentive to the small signals that Claire sent, receptive to the stories she gradually shared about her memories of Lily and the time before the accident. Good morning. A small but clear voice sounded from the kitchen door. Claire was standing there, still in her flannel pajamas, her brown hair tousled, framing her face. Good morning, birthday girl, Edward smiled, opening his arms in a silent invitation. To his joy, Claire approached and allowed him to hug her, not with the complete abandonment of before the accident, but with a conscious acceptance that, in many ways, was even more significant. 9 years old today, Edward commented, kissing the top of her head. Almost a young lady. Claire smiled shyly. Can I have pancakes for breakfast? It's my birthday. Anna was already separating the ingredients before Edward even responded. Of course, with honey and fruit, just as you like. While Claire sat at the kitchen table, watching Anna prepare the pancakes, Edward noticed how different she seemed from the silent and distant child of a few months ago. There was a presence in her now, a connection with the environment and the people around her, that had been absent for so long. "Nervous about your performance today?" he asked casually, sitting beside her. Claire considered the question for a moment. "A little," she admitted. "But Julie says that being nervous is normal before playing for people. Even great musicians get nervous." "She's right," Edward confirmed, "and you're very well prepared. I've been hearing you practice every day." "The music is ready now," Claire said, a gleam of determination in her eyes. "Mommy would like it." "I'm sure she would, sweetheart," Edward replied, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that arose whenever Claire mentioned Lily with this newly found naturalness. "She would be very proud of you." The rest of the morning passed in an atmosphere of tranquil anticipation. Claire alternated between moments of excitement about the party, the first real celebration of her birthday in years, and periods of silent concentration, mentally practicing her performance. Julie arrived shortly before lunch, bringing with her a carefully wrapped package. "Happy birthday, Claire," she smiled, handing the present to the girl. Claire opened the wrapping carefully, revealing a small sheet music notebook bound in blue leather, with her name engraved on the cover. "For you to write your own music," Julie explained as Claire examined the present with wondering eyes. "You have music inside you, Claire. Not just your mother's, but your own too." "Thank you," Claire replied, hugging the notebook against her chest before doing something that surprised everyone. She stood up and gave Julie a spontaneous hug. The afternoon brought with it the modest but significant celebration that Edward had planned. It wouldn't be a big party. Claire still wasn't ready for much social stimulation, but a few carefully selected guests. Claire's paternal grandmother, who had come from Chicago especially for the occasion, two cousins close to Claire in age, Dr. Francis, the psychologist who had followed the case from the beginning and was amazed at the girl's progress, and some of Edward's work colleagues whom Claire knew and felt comfortable with. The winter garden had been transformed with simple but elegant decorations, soft lights hung among the plants, tables with white tablecloths, a small space organized as a presentation area, with the grand piano that normally stayed in the music room carefully transferred to the location. Claire, dressed in a simple but pretty blue dress, the color that had become her signature since she began to reconnect with the world, observed the final preparations with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Everything looks very beautiful," she commented to Edward while adjusting the ribbon in her hair. "But there are a lot of people. They're just people who love you," Edward assured. "And you don't need to talk to everyone if you don't want to. Today is your day. You decide how you want to spend it." Claire nodded, visibly relieved by the permission to establish her own limits. "I want to play the music," she said with determination. "That's the most important thing." As the guests arrived, Claire stayed close to Edward or Julie, receiving birthday wishes with shy smiles and brief responses. Her grandmother, moved by her granddaughter's visible progress, respected the space that Claire established, avoiding the effusive hugs that were her trademark before the accident. "She's so different, Edward," Mrs. Harrison commented, watching Claire briefly interact with her cousins. "There's light in her eyes again." "We owe it to Julie," Edward replied, discreetly indicating the young caregiver who was calmly conversing with Dr. Francis. "She found a path when all of us had given up." "Don't underestimate your own participation," Mrs. Harrison gently corrected. "I've seen how you've transformed in these last few months. You're present in a way you weren't before." Edward couldn't deny the observation. Claire's recovery process had transformed not just the girl, but himself as well. Fatherhood, which previously shared space with his professional obligations, now occupied the center of his life in a way he had never imagined possible. When the small celebration was in full swing, Julie discreetly gathered the guests around the area where the piano had been positioned. Edward took his place in the first row of chairs, feeling his heart accelerate in anticipation. "Claire would like to share something special with all of you today," Julie announced with a warm smile. "A musical piece that's very important to her." Claire approached the piano, visibly nervous but determined. She sat on the bench, carefully adjusting it as Julie had taught her. Her eyes met Edward's in the audience, and he offered an encouraging smile. For a moment, Claire just contemplated the keys, as if silently communicating with them. Then, without additional announcement, she began to play. The first notes of Lily's composition filled the winter garden, clear and precise. Edward immediately recognized the first part, the section that Lily had completed before the accident. The simple but deeply emotional melody seemed to float among the plants and lights, as if the music itself were a living being. When Claire reached the point where the original composition ended, there was a brief pause, almost imperceptible to those who didn't know the story behind the piece. Then, without interruption, she continued. The transition to the part that she herself had helped to complete was smooth, natural, as if both sections had always been destined to exist together. Edward felt silent tears rolling down his face as he listened. There was something deeply moving about the image of his daughter at the piano, continuing Lily's musical legacy, transforming an unfinished work into something complete and new. It was as if, through the music, mother and daughter were conversing again, overcoming the barriers of time and loss. When the last note resonated and gradually disappeared, there was a moment of absolute silence in the winter garden. Then, to everyone's surprise, Claire did something unexpected. She turned on the piano bench and spoke, her voice small but clear. "This music is called New Beginnings," she said. "My mother wrote the first part for me, and I helped finish it. It's about how some things seem to end, but they actually just change form." The profound simplicity of Claire's words touched everyone present. Edward saw his mother discreetly wiping away tears, while Dr. Francis observed with evident professional admiration the extraordinary progress of her patient. The applause that followed was warm but contained, respectful of the emotional atmosphere that Claire had created. The girl smiled shyly, accepting the compliments with a nod of her head, before quickly returning to Edward's side. "You were incredible," he whispered, hugging her carefully. "Simply incredible, Claire." "I did it right," she replied, not as a question, but as a satisfied observation. "The music is complete now." "Yes, it is," Edward agreed, understanding that she was referring to much more than just the composition. The party continued smoothly after the performance, with the guests respecting Claire's wish not to make the music the center of all conversations. There was cake, presents, and the quiet joy of a celebration that marked not just a birthday, but a rebirth. By nightfall, when the last guests were saying goodbye, Edward found Claire and Julie sitting on a bench in the garden, watching the first stars appear in the Boston sky. "It was a special day," Julie commented when Edward joined them. "The best birthday," Claire agreed, her face showing the satisfied tiredness of someone who had completed something important. "Julie," Edward began, feeling it was time for a conversation he had been postponing. "Your work with Claire, you achieved what no one else could." Julie smiled but shook her head slightly. "I just showed the path. Claire made the journey on her own." "Not alone," Claire gently corrected, looking at both of them. "The three of us did it together." The simplicity of the observation deeply touched Edward. It was true. Claire's recovery had not been the result of a single person's work, but of a shared journey, of connections slowly rebuilt day after day. "The initial contract we made is coming to an end," Edward continued, addressing Julie, "but I'd like to propose something different." Julie looked at him with curiosity. "Claire still needs support, though in a different way now," Edward explained, "and you've become important to both of us. I'd like you to consider staying, not just as a caregiver, but as a music teacher for Claire. She has a talent that deserves to be nurtured." Julie's surprise was evident. "It would be an honor," she replied after a moment. "Claire has a natural gift for music, but I have to ask her too." She turned to the girl. "What do you think, Claire? Would you like me to continue teaching music to you?" "Yes," Claire replied without hesitation. "I want to learn to write my own music, like Mommy did." "Then it's decided," Edward smiled, feeling a sense of continuity that he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't the end of something, but the beginning of a new phase, for Claire, for himself, for the mansion that finally felt like a home again. Later that night, after Claire fell asleep, exhausted but happy, Edward found Julie on the porch in her usual evening tea ritual. "She fell asleep as soon as she touched the bed," he commented, accepting the cup that Julie offered. "I think the emotion of the day finally caught up with her." "She was brave today," Julie observed, "not just for playing in public, but for sharing something so personal." Edward nodded, looking at the city lights in the distance. When you arrived here, Julie, I had lost hope. Not just for Claire, but for everything. I was living in a kind of limbo, neither really moving forward nor able to go back. And now? Julie asked softly. Now, Edward reflected, searching for the right words. Now I feel like we're all learning to play a new music, different from the previous one, but no less beautiful because of that. Julie smiled, understanding the metaphor. The best compositions often emerge from the most difficult experiences, she commented. Claire intuitively understands this. That's why she was able to complete Lily's music so perfectly. Do you think she'll continue to improve? Edward asked, a last shadow of concern in his voice. I have no doubts, Julie replied with conviction. There will be challenges, of course. Difficult days, memories that still need to be processed. But the silence has been broken, Edward. The music has returned. And once we find our voice, we rarely lose it completely again. Edward contemplated Julie's words as he observed the night sky. The pain of losing Lily would never completely disappear, neither for him nor for Claire. But now there was room for other things too, for good memories shared aloud, for new music, for rebuilt connections. The mansion in Beacon Hill, once a monument to silence and loss, was gradually transforming back into a home. The corridors that echoed lonely footsteps now occasionally resonated with a child's voice, humming improvised melodies. The piano, once covered and forgotten, had again become the beating heart of the house, and Edward, who for so long had felt like a helpless spectator in his own daughter's life, now actively participated in her journey of recovery. The next morning, Edward woke to the sound of the piano. Following the music, he found Claire in the music room, not practicing Lily's composition, but experimenting with something new. Hesitant notes, repeated, adjusted, as if she were seeking her own melody. Beside her on the piano bench was the sheet music notebook that Julie had given her, open to a blank page waiting to be filled. And in Claire's hand, a pencil poised over the paper, ready to record whatever emerged from her musical exploration. Edward remained at the door without announcing his presence, witnessing the moment with a deep sense of gratitude. Claire wasn't just recovering her voice, she was finding a new voice, entirely her own. The composition she was trying to create was still fragmented, uncertain, like the first steps of a child learning to walk. But there was beauty in that uncertainty, in that process of discovery. It was the sound of a young person seeking her own form of expression, transforming experiences, both painful and joyful, into something new and unique. As he watched his daughter explore musical possibilities, Edward understood that there was a powerful metaphor in what he was witnessing. All of them, Claire, himself, even Julie, were, in their own way, composing new melodies from the notes that life had given them, creating beauty from fragments, harmony from dissonance, continuity from interruptions. Claire finally noticed his presence and looked up, a shy but genuine smile lighting up her face. "Good morning, Daddy," she said, her voice clear in the morning light. "I'm making a new song." "I'm listening," Edward smiled, entering the room. "It sounds beautiful." "It's not finished yet," Claire warned, looking at the sparse notes she had written in the notebook. "It's going to take a while." "That's okay," Edward replied, sitting beside her on the piano bench. "We have all the time in the world.